Top 1. The Sandby Borg Massacre. The walls of a 5th century ring fort on the Swedish island of Öland did not fall due to war, they fell into silence. No one was left to hold them up. When archaeologists first broke ground at the site known as Sandby Borg, they expected the ordinary remnants of an Iron Age settlement. What they found instead was something that no framework in forensic archaeology had prepared them for: a skeleton on the floor of a house, unburied and undisturbed. Then another, and then another, 26 bodies in total, distributed across the interior of a ring fort that had simply been sealed and abandoned. It was left exactly as it was on the night everything ended. The bodies showed no signs of burial rituals, no post-mortem arrangement, and no attempt at recovery. They were exactly where they fell. Blade wounds marked the bones, along with blunt force trauma consistent with clubs and axes, and sharp-edged cuts from swords delivered at close range. The violence was not random. It was efficient, targeted, and complete. Every person inside Sandby Borg was killed, and not one survived to bury the dead. Inside one of the excavated houses, a half-eaten fish was found beside a body. The meal had not been finished. Whatever arrived that night arrived without warning. There was no time to stand, no time to flee, and no time to fight back in any coordinated way. The fish remained on the floor for 15 centuries before anyone saw it again. Among the remains, archaeologists recovered gold and silver coins, rings and jewelry of considerable value. None of it had been taken. This rules out robbery as a motive with near certainty. Whoever carried out the massacre at Sandby Borg did not want valuables. They wanted the people inside dead, and the fort left exactly as it was. A deliberate abandonment, a monument to something. After the killing, the gates were closed. The bodies were left inside. The surrounding community, whatever remained of it, never re-entered for reasons that have never been explained. No one came back to collect the dead, no neighboring settlement attempted a burial, and no record from the period references the event. An entire community was erased, and the world around it simply moved on. Isotope analysis of the skeletal remains revealed that some of the victims were not local. They had traveled to Sandby Borg from elsewhere, possibly as guests or as residents who had relocated. Their presence raises questions that compound the mystery. Was this a targeted political execution, a tribal annihilation, or a coordinated act of revenge against a specific group? Every theory requires evidence that does not exist. No attacker has ever been identified. No motive has ever been confirmed. And no account from any surviving contemporary source describes the event. The ring fort stood silent for over 1,000 years before the bones were found. And the bones have told us everything except the one thing that matters. Who came through the gates that night, and why did they leave everything behind except the dead? Top 2. Pangayasidi Cave on the Kenyan coast. Buried beneath layers of forest soil and collapsed sediment, there is a cave that human beings never stopped using, not for a generation, not for a century, but for 78,000 years. When archaeologists began excavating the Pangayasidi cave network in Kilifi County, Kenya, they were not expecting to find a continuous record of human occupation stretching from the Middle Stone Age to near modern times. What they uncovered was not a single settlement or a buried campsite. It was an unbroken thread of human presence, running across more than 300 generations, layered into the earth with the precision of a geological record. No other site in sub-Saharan Africa has produced evidence of continuous habitation on this scale. The main chamber of the cave network spans over 1,000 square feet. Michael Petraglia, director of the Australian Research Centre for Human Evolution, confirmed that the space was large enough to have housed hundreds of people at a time. It was not a temporary shelter or a seasonal refuge. It was a home returned to again and again by people who had no written language, no maps, and no way of knowing that the generations before them had stood in the same darkness and made the same fires. The earliest artifacts recovered from the deepest excavation layers date to approximately 78,000 years ago. These were large, relatively unrefined stone tools associated with early Middle Stone Age populations navigating an uncertain and often hostile continent. Then something changed. Around 67,000 years ago, the tool assemblage shifted. Smaller, more specialized arrowheads and blades began appearing in the layers. The people using this cave were not the same people who had first entered it. They were more refined, more deliberate, and more technically sophisticated. The cave had outlasted entire evolutionary leaps in human cognition and survived to record all of them. What kept people returning across such an incomprehensible span of time comes down to one factor that archaeology rarely gets to measure directly: climate stability. While vast regions of Africa endured repeated cycles of drought, desertification, and ecological collapse, the tropical forests surrounding Pangayasaidi maintained a relatively consistent environment. Water sources held and vegetation persisted. The forest did not abandon this corner of Kenya, and so the people did not abandon the cave. This matters because it reframes how we understand human survival during the most volatile periods of prehistoric climate change. When the continent fractured into uninhabitable zones, there were pockets of stability, and Panga was one of them. A refugee preserved by geography, returned to by necessity, and slowly transformed from a shelter into a cultural anchor. 78,000 years of continuous human presence means that this cave witnessed the entire arc of what we call prehistory. It was occupied before Homo sapiens had left Africa and was still being used after they had spread across every continent on Earth. The people who first entered Pangayasaidi could not have imagined us, and yet the same walls held them. The same dark interior absorbed their fires, their tools, their dead, and their children. Whatever drove human beings back to this cave across an unimaginable stretch of time was not recorded in any language. It is recorded only in the layers of earth that archaeologists are still carefully, methodically removing. Each layer contains a version of us that we no longer recognize. Top 3, the Hierakonpolis Animal Zoo. 5,000 years ago, before the first stone of any pyramid was cut, and before the great monuments of Egypt had been imagined, a town on the western bank of the Nile was already keeping elephants. Hierakonpolis was among the most powerful urban centers of pre-dynastic Egypt. It was not a village. It was a place of administration, ritual, and wealth. A settlement large enough and organized enough to sustain a class of elite residents whose appetite for status extended beyond gold and land into something far more deliberate. They kept wild animals not as livestock or food sources, but as symbols of dominance over the natural world. Living displays of power maintained within the boundaries of a civilization that was still learning what civilization meant. When archaeologists excavated the animal cemetery at Hierakonpolis, the inventory was not what anyone expected from a 5,000-year-old site. 2 elephants, multiple baboons, a hippopotamus, wildcats, dogs, and other exotic species were buried in a dedicated area that indicated intentional disposal, not accidental accumulation. The sheer variety of the collection pointed to something organized and sustained. These animals had not wandered into the settlement and died. They had been obtained, transported, and kept alive. Then the bones began to tell a more complicated story. Several of the baboon skeletons showed evidence of healed fractures, not fresh breaks or injuries sustained at the moment of death, but old wounds that had closed and calcified over time. The hippopotamus showed the same pattern. These were fractures consistent with violent capture, the stress of physical restraint, and the trauma of being taken from a wild environment and forced into confinement. These were injuries that would have been lethal without intervention. Bones do not heal in the wild when predators are present and movement is compromised. They heal in controlled environments where the animal is protected, fed, and kept stationary long enough for the body to repair itself. This is how archaeologists know these animals were not simply caught and displayed briefly before dying. They were maintained and cared for in the functional sense, if not necessarily the compassionate one. Keepers would have monitored their conditions, managed their injuries, and ensured their survival because a dead exotic animal held no status value. The investment was too significant to allow the animals to perish from neglect. What this reveals about pre-dynastic Egypt is difficult to overstate. The infrastructure required to capture a wild elephant, transport it along the Nile, house it within an urban settlement, and keep it alive long enough for its fractures to heal completely was not simple. It demanded resources, specialized knowledge, and a social structure capable of supporting what was, in every functional sense, the earliest documented zoo in human history. The animals buried at Hierakonpolis lived confined lives far from the environments that produced them. Their bones recorded that confinement with forensic precision. Every healed fracture is a document of captivity, a record of the exact moment when human ambition decided that the wild world could be owned, displayed, and controlled. That instinct did not begin with Rome or Renaissance menageries. It began here in the dust of a pre-dynastic Egyptian town 5 centuries before anyone thought to build a pyramid. Top 4. The Vampire Child of Poland. In a 17th century cemetery in Pien, Poland, archaeologists uncovered a child buried face down in the earth, with a padlock fastened around its foot. The lock was triangular and functional, not decorative. Someone had placed it there deliberately with the intention of keeping something inside the ground. The burial was discovered in 2022 during excavations led by Professor Dariusz Polinsky of Nicolaus Copernicus University. The child was between 9 and 10 years old at the time of death. The face-down position was not an accidental misplacement or post-mortem soil movement. It was a deliberate burial orientation that appears consistently across Eastern European archaeological sites associated with individuals communities feared might return from the dead. Turning the body face down was a practical measure rooted in specific folk belief. If the corpse attempted to rise, it would dig downward, away from the surface and the living. The padlock on the foot reinforced this intention beyond any reasonable doubt. In the vampire folklore traditions of 17th century Poland, iron and locks carried symbolic and spiritual weight as binding instruments capable of restraining not just the physical body, but the animating force believed to persist within it after death. The triangular shape of this particular lock held additional significance within regional superstition as a geometry associated with containment and finality. Someone had not simply buried this child, they had imprisoned it. What makes this discovery forensically unsettling is not the folklore, but the question of what this child had done or what had happened to it to warrant such treatment from its own community. Vampire burials in this period were not applied arbitrarily. They were reserved for individuals who died under circumstances considered spiritually dangerous, such as suicide, sudden unexplained death, or deaths preceded by illness that spread to others. The community's decision to bury this child with restraints suggests they believed with complete sincerity that leaving it unbound posed a genuine threat to the living. Alongside the padlock, excavators found a silk cap resting near the child's head. Silk in 17th century rural Poland was an expensive material reserved for individuals of elevated social standing. The presence of the cap introduces a contradiction. This was not a child from the margins of society, but one whose family had means. And yet the community or the family itself chose to bury it with the same precautions applied to the most feared of the restless dead. No cause of death has been determined, as the skeletal remains showed no obvious trauma or signs of disease. The circumstances that led the living to fear the dead remain completely unknown. What was buried in Payan was a child, but what the people believed they were containing was something else entirely. The padlock was still fastened when archaeologists found it. Whatever they were afraid of, they made sure it stayed down. And for nearly 400 years it did. Top 5. The Range Creek Ruins. For decades, a rancher in central Utah drove past ancient pit houses, prehistoric rock paintings, stone tool caches, and carved cliff markings every single day. Yet he said nothing to anyone. When visitors approached the gate at the edge of his 4,000-acre property along Range Creek, they found it locked with signs reading, "Road closed." They turned around, and the secrets behind those gates remained exactly where a civilization had left them 1,000 years ago. Waldo Wilcox had inherited the ranch from his father, and with it an unspoken agreement that what existed on that land was not for the outside world. The artifacts scattered across Range Creek Canyon were not a footnote. They were embedded throughout it. Pit houses were dug into hillsides, rock art was painted onto canyon walls, and prehistoric alignment lines were etched into the terrain. Stone tools were left in positions so undisturbed that archaeologists would later describe the site as a time capsule of almost unparalleled preservation. The Wilcox family had known about it for generations and chose deliberately to say nothing. The people who left these remnants behind were the Fremont, a distinct prehistoric culture that occupied the Colorado Plateau and the Great Basin from approximately 400 CE to 1300 CE. The Fremont are not well understood. Unlike the ancestral Puebloans to their south, they did not leave behind large architectural complexes. They built smaller, dispersed settlements, stored food in elevated granaries tucked into cliff faces, and produced a rock art tradition that remains only partially interpreted. They disappeared from the archaeological record around the 13th century, and the reasons for their departure have never been established. What Wilcox had been quietly protecting was one of the most intact Fremont archaeological landscapes ever documented. The isolation of Range Creek Canyon, accessible only through private land, had shielded the site from artifact hunting, vandalism, and casual destruction. No collectors had removed the tools, no graffiti covered the rock art, and no amateur excavations had disturbed the pit house floors. The land functioned as an accidental preserve, maintained by locked gates in a family silence. When Wilcox reached an age where managing the terrain was no longer viable, he sold the property to the Utah Bureau of Land Management at a price significantly below market value. Archaeologists who gained access for the first time described their initial surveys as overwhelming. The density of undisturbed material was unlike anything most had encountered in the American West. The site is now managed by the Utah Museum of Natural History with carefully controlled access. One family's silence preserved what a century of archaeology could not. The Fremont left Range Creek and never came back for reasons unknown, leaving their tools and structures to wait in a locked canyon until a rancher finally decided it was time for someone else to hold the key. Top 6. The Sungir Royal Burial. 34,000 years ago, east of what is now Moscow, two children were placed into the earth with more care, ceremony, and material wealth than almost any burial archaeologists have ever uncovered from the Paleolithic period. They were 10 and 12 years old and both showed signs of physical disability. Whoever buried them wanted the world to know that these children mattered in ways that ordinary death could not diminish. The site is called Sungir. Excavated by Soviet archaeologists beginning in the 1950s, it remains one of the most studied prehistoric burial sites in the world. The graves date to approximately 34,000 years ago, placing them in the Upper Paleolithic, a period when modern humans were navigating an Ice Age landscape alongside megafauna, without agriculture or permanent settlements. Yet what was found in those graves suggested a social system sophisticated enough to bury its children like kings. The two adolescent boys were interred head-to-head. Surrounding them was an inventory of grave goods including 10,000 mammoth ivory beads. These beads had been sewn into clothing, covering the bodies from head to foot in garments that researchers estimate would have taken an individual approximately 10,000 hours to produce. There were also more than 20 ivory armbands, nearly 300 pierced fox teeth, and 16 ivory spears, some of which were so long they were impractical as weapons, suggesting they were made specifically for the grave. Human fibulae, leg bones from another individual, were also placed across the chest of each child with deliberate intention. Interestingly, the adults buried at Sungir during the same period had almost none of this, only a handful of beads and basic tools. This inversion of hierarchical burial traditions has driven decades of academic debate. The disability element deepens the mystery. One of the boys had a condition affecting the curvature of his femurs, meaning he would have walked with difficulty and likely could not have participated in the physical demands of hunter-gatherer life. In a subsistence society, this child would have required sustained care from others to survive into adolescence. He was not a productive member in a conventional economic sense, yet he was buried with more wealth than anyone else. This tells us the people of Sungir were making choices rooted in social value, symbolic status, or inherited identity. These children were not buried like royalty because of what they had done, but because of what they represented. What that was, no one has yet been able to determine with certainty. Top 7. The Terracotta Army. In the spring of 1974, farmers digging a well outside the city of Xi'an in Shanxi province struck something hard beneath the dry earth. What they pulled from the ground was a fragment of a clay head, life-size, detailed, and unlike anything they recognized. Archaeologists arrived, and what followed was the uncovering of one of the most staggering discoveries in history. a buried army of 8,000 soldiers that had been standing in formation underground for more than 2,000 years, waiting for an emperor who never came back to lead them. The Terracotta Army was commissioned by Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, who took the throne in 246 BCE at age 13. He spent decades consolidating power through military force and absolute authority, while simultaneously preparing for death with systematic intensity. Construction of his mausoleum complex began the same year he assumed power and continued for 38 years, employing an estimated 700,000 workers. What they produced was a parallel empire built underground to replicate everything Qin Shi Huang controlled in life. The 8,000 clay warriors are not mass-produced. Each face is individual, each expression is distinct, and variations in hairstyle and armor suggest sculptors worked from real soldiers as references. The warriors were originally painted in vivid pigments and held real bronze and iron weapons. The horses are full-sized, and the chariots are constructed with technical accuracy. Infantry fill the front lines while officers stand at the rear, replicating the organizational logic of a functioning military across 3 excavated pits. A 4th pit was found empty, possibly a command headquarters that was never staffed because the emperor died before completion. At the center of the complex, beneath a man-made hill that has never been opened, lies the tomb of Qin Shi Huang himself. Ancient records describe rivers of mercury flowing through a scale model of his empire, with pearls in the ceiling representing stars and mechanical crossbows rigged to fire at intruders. Soil samples from the mound have confirmed abnormally high concentrations of mercury, lending credibility to these accounts. The tomb has not been excavated due to concerns about structural instability and the limitations of current preservation methods. Peripheral excavations have uncovered bronze birds, musicians, and acrobats, suggesting an interior design for an eternal court. The emperor built everything he needed for a reign without end, and the ground above him has not moved in over 2,000 years. Top 8. The Atacama Skeleton Mystery. In 2003, in the driest desert on Earth, someone found a mummified body the size of a human hand. It was 6 inches long with an elongated cone-shaped skull and ribs thinner than toothpicks. Its bones were dense and fully formed in ways that defied its size. When photographs circulated, the public response was not archaeological curiosity, but something more visceral. People saw something that did not belong to this world. The specimen was discovered in a deserted Chilean mining town called La Noria in the Atacama Desert, wrapped in cloth and tucked behind an abandoned church. It was naturally mummified by the extreme aridity. It spent years in private hands before researchers gained access for scientific study, by which point the alien theory had already embedded itself in public consciousness. However, DNA sequencing confirmed she was human, unambiguously and without qualification. Her genetic profile aligned with indigenous Chilean populations with some European ancestry. She was a girl born in northern Chile who died in circumstances that have never been fully established. What the DNA could not immediately explain was how a body measuring 6 inches could have the bone density of a 6-year-old child. This biological paradox took years of research to address. Researchers identified 7 distinct genetic mutations in her genome, all associated with skeletal growth and development. These mutations affect the systems that regulate bone formation and structural organization. The specific combination present in her genome was unlike anything previously documented in medical literature. Each mutation was known to cause abnormalities, but the simultaneous presence of all 7 produced something with no clinical precedent. Whether she was stillborn or survived for a period after birth has not been determined, and the cause of her death remains unknown. The reason she was wrapped in cloth and left behind a church wall has never been explained. Science has established that she was human, female, and genetically connected to the land. Yet her body expressed a constellation of mutations the medical community had never encountered before. The desert preserved her with extraordinary completeness, but everything about her remains a mystery, and the questions her 6-inch frame continues to generate have not diminished in the 2 decades since she was found. Top 9. The Chiribaya Pet Cemetery. 1,000 years ago on the southern coast of what is now Peru, A community buried its dead with the same care and ceremony extended to any member of the group. Some of those graves contained blankets, food offerings, and personal items. Some of them held dogs. Peruvian anthropologist Sonia Guillen was leading excavations at a cemetery belonging to the Chiribaya culture, a pre-Inca civilization that flourished between 900 and 1350 CE. The Chiribaya were a sophisticated society with developed agricultural practices and burial customs that reflected complex beliefs about death and identity. Guillen's team was prepared for human remains, but they were not prepared for 43 dogs. The animals had been buried in separate plots positioned near their human owners. This was not accidental proximity. The spatial relationship was deliberate, mirroring in death the relationships that existed in life. The dogs had been interred individually, each in its own dedicated space. Many were buried with food and wrapped in blankets. These were not symbolic gestures performed hastily. They were considered provisions to sustain the dogs in whatever existed beyond death. The Chiribaya were not disposing of animals. They were burying companions. The functional role of these dogs was also documented. They were herding animals used to manage llama flocks across the difficult desert terrain. Llamas were central to Chiribaya economic life, and a dog capable of managing a herd was a vital working partner. The burials reflect an understanding of that contribution that extended into reciprocal obligation. The extreme aridity of the region preserved the dog remains with exceptional completeness, allowing fur and soft tissue to be assessed. Guillen observed a morphological consistency that pointed toward a modern breed. The Chiribaya dogs bore a striking resemblance to the Peruvian shepherd dogs still found in the region today. Her team has been working to establish a formal genetic lineage connecting the ancient dogs to the modern breed. If confirmed, it would represent an unbroken line of selective breeding and cultural continuity stretching across a millennium. A living dog walking the same terrain as its ancestors, descended from animals that were once buried with blankets and food by people who believed they deserved to be mourned. The cemetery south of Lima holds 43 graves that contain animals someone 1,000 years ago decided were worth remembering. Top 10. The medieval coffin birth. 1,300 years ago in the northern Italian town of Imola, a pregnant woman was buried in the earth before her child could be born. She did not survive long enough to deliver. What happened after her burial was recorded in the position of bones that archaeologists found exactly as the body's own chemistry had arranged them centuries later. The fetus was found between her legs, displaced and partially delivered, a process that required no living assistance. This is called a coffin birth, a rare and forensically striking phenomenon. As a body decomposes, gases produced by bacterial activity accumulate and expel whatever occupies the abdominal cavity. In a pregnant woman, the fetus is pushed through the birth canal by decomposition alone. While documented in historical records, coffin births remain uncommon because conditions must be specific for skeletal evidence to remain identifiable. The Imola burial preserved both mother and fetus with enough integrity to confirm the context. However, when archaeologists examined the mother's skull, the case became even more complex. There was a small, deliberately circular hole in her head made before she died. The bone showed evidence of partial healing, confirming the procedure was performed on a living woman who survived it long enough for repair to begin. This procedure is called trepanation, one of the oldest surgical interventions in human history. In medieval Europe, it was performed to address head trauma, pressure, or conditions understood in spiritual terms. Practitioners worked without anesthesia or sterile instruments, and many patients died, but this woman survived long enough to show healing bone. Researchers propose that trepanation may have been an attempt to treat eclampsia or preeclampsia, pregnancy-related conditions involving high blood pressure and seizures. A medieval physician seeing a pregnant woman in convulsions would have seen a woman whose head was causing her body to destroy itself. The logical intervention was to open it. She died anyway, her child was delivered by decomposition into a grave, and the hole in her skull remains the only surviving evidence that someone had tried to save her. If these stories of ancient massacres, hidden refugees, and the mysterious bonds between the living and the dead have changed the way you look at history, please subscribe and like this video. We are unearthing the secrets that time tried to bury, and we want you with us as we dig deeper. Join our community to help Gyeotrong Tong Lai. The next treasury of history will be opened very soon.